So another Patreon Q&A. Thank you again, Patreons, so much for your support. I hope you had a nice summer vacation. I would like to thank also PathSet and Flag for donating their commercial collections to the monthly giveaways we do on Discord. So if you are a Patreon, come join us also on Discord. We have a lovely community there and monthly challenges and giveaways. If you are not a Patreon, consider joining us on Patreon. Lots and lots of extra content and all sorts of different fun things. And let's start with the Q&A. So the first question is coming from Marcus. Hi, love the new Aphex Twin EP black box live recorder in a room. I really love all the variety of ghost notes and micro timing in the percussion for in a room. Would love any suggestions for adding some of that in VC VRAC. So I like adding ghost notes and all sorts of different textures to sound with a delay, basically modulating the delay, bringing it in and out, and creating like these sorts of additional notes that can add lots and lots of texture, and again, sorts of ghost notes. So here I have a kick, some hi-hat, and a snare with tremor FM and tremor from Volt. So this is the kick and the hi-hat. This. Right, of course, I will put the patch also on Patreon so you can download it and have a closer look. Right, but now listen to the snare. The snare is still not playing and it's still muted, but listen to the snare now. It's going through Prince of Perception, the delay from Flag. And as you can see, I'm using one chances, which will add probability to the modulation to bring in the mix, and another chances to change from a reverse playback or forward playback. Right, so this adds lots and lots of sorts of ghost notes. Listen to this. Right, and the delay is not always there because the mix is being modulated or opened and closed. Sometimes in reverse, sometimes forward. Right? So this adds lots and lots of movement. I have here also a sort of, maybe it's a rim shot, I'm not so sure, with another tremor, a phaser, and again a delay. This is Chronoblob 2. Again, I'm using chances to add probability to the mix, opening and closing, and adding more texture and more additional notes to everything. Right? So sometimes it's there, the delay, sometimes it's not. Adding texture, removing texture, you just have to add a nice bass to this that I have here with the 8-second kick all. Right, and again, it's a very, very simple patch. I didn't do anything too amazing here, but just the modulation of the mix of the delay already adds lots and lots of variation and texture. The next one is coming from Eric. For some time now, I've been looking for a module that can map successive semitones on one input to the successive notes of a chord on a second polyphonic input. For example, if the input chord is E, G, B, then input C is mapped to output E, C sharp to G, D to B, D sharp to E an octave higher, and so on. Do you know if such a module exists? I want to use this to turn any sequencer into a pattern arpeggiator by mapping the output of the sequencer to a chord. So no, I don't know of a specific module that can do this, but I found somewhat of a workaround which will not really work as you want. But eventually the result is that you can use a sequencer to sequence the notes of a chord, basically. So what I have here, I have a chord generator coming from the note sec from Impromptu, right? So this is generating the chord. It has 8 channels of polyphony in this case. You can use as many as you want. You can use any other chord generators you want. Now the thing is, you will have, in this case, to split this polyphonic signal into the individual notes, and then use a switch to switch between them. Now, first of all, the first thing I wish that I could do with this switch and other switches is just input the polyphonic signal directly to input 1, and from there it will be already spread out to the different channels. But in this case, again, we have to split. And this sequential switch, and there are others also, have a step input that you can input CV and step between the steps, or switch rather between the steps. And again, in this case, I wish it could work also with chromatic notes, so C, C sharp, D, and so on. It's not. So it will not map to C, C sharp, D, and so on, but it will map them, I believe, 0 to 8 or 0 to 10 volts, which still means that you can still use a sequencer to sequence the notes of the arpeggio, which is exactly what I'm doing here. So this is the voice FM operator. Right, you can hear the chords are changing. And now with the ADDR sequencer, for example, because it has also 8 steps, I can sequence the switch, basically. Now again, it will not work with chromatic notes, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, and so on, but still it will work with CV. Right, that you can still sequence this. Right, so now I have an arpeggio, it's arpeggiating the chords according to the ADDR sequencer. You can use any other sequencer you want. There are other switches also. There are switches from Count Modula that will work more or less the same, also with ADDR mode, so you can address the steps with voltage. But I couldn't find a switch that you could address with a chromatic scale. But still, you can use a sequencer to sequence the different notes of the chord. The next one is from Fick. Hi, I was wondering if you can check out Lawrence Music for Plants 3. I really like how he's working with textures, amplitude modulation, and some ring modulation. It would be really nice that you look into it and show your take on it. I find his approach to be different and refreshing, and have been trying some ideas, but nothing came close to what he does. So I will say it once again. I know I say it all the time. It's definitely not my forte. It's not my strength. To try and recreate other people's music and sound. I'm really bad at this. I should work on it and improve it. But there are only 24 hours in a day, unfortunately. So yes, again, I'm really bad at this, but there are two things I wanted to show you. So you mentioned amplitude modulation and some ring modulation. I just wanted to show you quickly that ring modulation is another type of amplitude modulation. It's just through zero, it's bipolar amplitude modulation. So here I have AM amplitude modulation with the unipolar LFO, and you can see it here, 0 to 10, modulating a VCA, right? So this is amplitude modulation, and ring modulation is basically using a voltage controlled attenuverter, or it's called also a polarizer. This is, for example, one for mutable instruments. Right, and you can see that in this case I'm using a bipolar LFO, and again the modulation, ring modulation, is amplitude modulation just through zero, so it will work also with negative voltages. Right, so basically ring modulation is another type of amplitude modulation. I just wanted to mention this just for fun. And here I have a small patch that I built, and I believe these are some of the techniques that are being used in this piece of music, which is quite lovely. Yeah, so I believe there are some chords there that are being, the amplitude is being modulated randomly. So here in this case, I'm using the diatonic CV from Aaron Static to generate the chords, FM operator, of course, to play the chords. And I have some amplitude modulation going on. I could use also the level input, but I wanted to show you this, that instead of having the AM going from 0 to 10, the modulation movement or range, I used an offset module to offset this modulation a bit up. So it's not going all the way down there, it's not going all the way to silence, but it's staying somewhere there between 3/4 and full, right? So it will sound like this. And there is random modulation on the rate of this AM with the LFO. Of course, also this patch will be available on Patreon, so you can download it and have a closer look. Right, and sometimes it goes so high in frequency, you start getting those sidebands, or you start getting another frequency hiding there in the background. Right, another voice that I heard also a lot in this composition is basically noise. Now I used here something that is also quite interesting. I sent white noise instead directly like this to the filter. I sent it first through branches or the Bernoulli gate. There are other modules that can do this also in hardware. I personally use the one you flip from, I forgot, After Later Audio. I didn't forget, After Later Audio. It's a branches clone. Anyway, I'm sending it through branches just to get it a bit more crackly. So it's not directly white noise. It's a bit more with texture, so it will sound like this. Of course, panning modulation, some modulation for the filter. It's a bandpass filter. Right? So you can hear the texture. If I take it all the way left, just white noise, but then I can start adding those crackles to the sound. Right, somewhere here was nice. Right, and then we have some ring modulation. Let's wait for it. This one, two VCOs modulating each other. Some FM for their frequency, so the frequency is changing the frequency of modulation. Right, in this case I'm using Vinca from Instruo, also available in hardware, and it's the upper part is a voltage controlled attenuverter, so it's an attenuverter with a CV input, so you can use it for ring modulation. Again, ring modulation is another type of amplitude modulation. It's just bipolar, it's through zero, so you need an attenuverter for this, which is exactly what we have here on Vinca. Right, so it just adds a bit more interest to the sound. And there are also some notes that are just running in the background. Right, I'm using slips with full-on slips, so it's basically a random sequence. Really nice sequencer, I really like it, use it a lot. If you follow my channel, you see it quite a lot. And this is sequencing an FM voice with two FM operators. Right, there's just a bit of FM, some panning modulation with X fade. Right, and lots of reverb. Altogether it will sound like this. And the noise is quite loud because this is what I heard on the music, but we can turn it down also. Right, of course, I think there's a lot more reverb missing here to turn this a bit more washy. Maybe we can try, let's see if we can try and add even more reverb to everything. Yeah, something like this. The next question is from Carlos. My question is there a way to keep a gate on a particular step of a sequence staying open until the next step with an open gate, even if there are steps in between with closed gates? I'm trying to keep a sustain going for the notes in one of my sequences, but the closed gates in between the open gates cut off the sustain as the steps pass through the sequence. How can I get sustain from those notes if they are in a sequence that has some closed gates on it? Okay, so first of all, in VCVREC you can use something like gates to change the length of the gate. In hardware, there are many modules that you can use to control the gate of the length, even math or rampage or something like this. So here I have a sequence. Right, and let's say that here I have two closed notes, but I want the sustain to stay up, basically. You see I have sustain all the way up, and I want this note to sustain. So I can use gates, again from VCV, send my gate through it, use the gate output, and now I can control the length of this gate. So I can use a CV input from the sequencer to control the length, and say that here I would like to have a longer gate. Right? Maybe a bit shorter here. Right? So here I have sustain because the length of the gate is longer. You can see it here also in the light. Right, so the gate stays longer open and it will keep the sustain. So this is one thing you can do. Right, and this will work also with other sequences also. For example, here I'm using slips again, and I'm using an additional sequencer, the ADDR sequencer, which is great for stuff like this, to change the length of the gates, and by this add sustain basically on different steps. Right? Right, so this is also something you can try. And in VCV rack and also in hardware, there are some modules or sequencers that have this functionality built in. For example, the sequencers from Count Modula. If you are using the gate output, not the trigger, but the gate output, as long as there are successive steps with the gate open, it will just keep this gate open for the duration of these steps, right? And you will have the sustain, so it will sound like this. Right? Right, so you can use something like the sequencers from Count Modula, and of course also the sequencers from Impromptu will work the same. They have the tied step function, which will basically leave the gate open for successive notes. So here, for example, it's activated. So these two steps, actually three, actually four steps will have the gate open on them because the tied step is connected. Right, so if I run this, right, so you can use also dedicated sequencers. Let me just shut this down. Dedicated sequencers that have this functionality built in. And if you don't want to, or you want to do even something generative, the gates module from VCV will work really nicely for this. The next one is from Vladi. I would like to hear your best practices of using dual filters to shape the sound, parallel, serial connections, switch types of VCFs, and so on. So I'm not so sure about best practices, but there are a few things that you can experiment with. So for example, something I like doing is sending one voice or one oscillator to two different bandpass filters and modulating them with a random signal, a smooth random signal, and panning them left and right. In this case, it's the modern VCO, again, two bandpass filters. Oh, listen to this. Right, if you add some delay and reverb to this. Woo! Right, so again, two filters in parallel, one pan left, one pan right, bandpass filters, smooth random modulation. Really nice sound. Another one in parallel. In this case, it's two different low-pass filters. One will open while the other one will close. Again, in parallel, then being mixed together. Right, so this is, for example, one. I have here the VCO going through the CF100 low pass. You see it's closed a bit, and I'm using an envelope to open it. It will sound like this. right? Nothing too special. And at the same time, this voice goes to another filter, another low pass. But in this case, it's open all the way and the envelope will close it. And it will sound like this. And then if you mix them back together, you get the attack of one filter and the release of the other, and it will sound like this. Again, without the second one, and with. Add some chorus to this. Ooh. So again, two filters in parallel, two low-pass filters. One will open with the envelope and one will close with the same envelope. And you can have different settings, one with more resonance, more drive, less resonance, less drive. You can experiment with this and get really interesting full sounds. And now in serial, so in series, two filters, one going to the other. Again, one VCO going to two bandpass filters, but in series. So it will go to one bandpass filter, from there to another one. And again, random modulation and everything, how they meet, of course, lots of resonance. How they meet, they will amplify different frequencies of the sound. And it sounds really nice. Again, a bit of delay, of course. Right, and the last example, something a bit classic, is sending a high pass to a low pass to accentuate the low frequency. So you have to find the sweet spot, resonance all the way up. You see high pass into low pass. Not all the way up, but resonance up. And then with the frequency knob, you find the frequency that really hits the bass, hits the low frequencies. And it sounds like this. Without. This is without the high pass. And now with. You get grit, you get texture. Very cool. So again, I'm not so sure about best practices, but these are some things you can experiment with. The next one is from Thomas. I found a nice video about shift register. Do you usually use one? If no, can you please show some good examples of using ML, shift register, and also other possible modules? So I don't usually use one, but sometimes I will, usually in generative patches where I want to create chords according to a sequence that's going on. So I use usually a shift register for generating chords. Just like I'm doing here, I have a random sequence coming from the random module from VCV, or not a sequence, but basically random notes. They are going, again, this patch also will be available on Patreon if you're interested. This is going to the shift register, and what the shift register will do, it acts a bit like sample and hold, but it will not only sample the pitch, it will also shift it down. So basically we get delayed copies of the pitch, and if you combine them, you get chords. Right, so I'm using 3 outputs with 3 different voices and some VCA modulation, and they are chords. Right? So you can use the shift register for chord. Something I saw in a loop-up video, I believe, is using a shift register basically to sort of save random voltages, like sort of a buffer. So here I have the Turing machine generating random sequences. This is going to the shift register, right? And it's already saved. I mean, until it will not get a trigger, nothing will change, right? And I'm sequencing this with a sequential switch, basically switching between the notes. Right, so now when I start hitting the trigger, the sequence will change and sort of save in a buffer the Turing machine. Right, and I can do this a bit more and have a sequence, do this a bit more and have a sequence. Right, I can do this also synced with the clock, for example, and sort of save sequences from the tool machine. Right, so this is also something that you can experiment with, and another module that you may want to experiment with in VCVRack is Shifty from PathSet. It's available for free, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and it's a shift register, but for gates with some interesting features. Right, so it has a built-in clock. In this case, you can use an external one. You can use also an external one to trigger it, right, like you trigger a shift register. And in this case, I have 3 outputs, triggering kick, snare, and hi-hat, and you can hear that they are one after the other because they are delayed, right? But here in this case, we can add echo that will add more hits, basically. Right, and we can add also some sort of muting and get interesting rhythms. Right, and you have also sorts of delays and other features that you can experiment with. And this is basically it. So I use it to create chords, and I don't use it, but I saw something on a Loopops video where you can save also sequences if you want to experiment with this. And a module that you might want to experiment with is Shifty, which is a shift register, but for gates. The next question is related to the previous one. This one is from Neil. Do you know of any hardware modules that resemble ML shift register in their simplicity and size? So there is, of course, Shifty from IntelliGel, which is a shift register with other functions also. It's small, but it has only 4 channels. The ML one has 8, although I find 4 more than enough, especially if you want to create chords and stuff. 4 outputs are more than enough, I guess. And it has all sorts of interesting features that you can experiment with. So Shifty is definitely an option. And if you don't mind to get something a bit bigger, this is the Step 8 from Geranalog. Again, it's much bigger, but it has 8 channels and it can do much, much more. It's very flexible. I don't have any experience with either Shifty or the Step 8, but from what I've seen online, and both of them are quite capable, and also the Step 8 is bigger, but it has more channels that you can experiment with. The next one is from Mr. Skip Monkey. Hi, I've just watched the excellent patch from scratch using Synthesis Technology Collection. And when you made the macro controls near the end, I got to wondering if there is a way to reset the pots so one can go nuts, then revert them all back to their starting position with one click or button press. So yes, there is a solution for this. Of course, it's coming from Stürmelder with 8-phase. So here I have exactly this patch. Right, and let's say that I want to go back to the, right, I want to make something crazy and then go back to have them all at 0. Right, so I'm going to use 8-phase. Right, I'm just going to use this here, for example. I'm going to bind the module. Actually, it doesn't even have to be close to it. I can select the module I want, right, which is this one. You see now it's connected to 8-phase. I can go to the writing mode and just write the first step and then go back to read, and then I can go crazy, press this, and everything goes back to 0, basically, right? And of course you can map this to a MIDI controller and all sorts of things, and you can also create sorts of scenes. So let's say that I want to have another scene with the hats a bit more crazy. Right, something like this. This can be the second one, and let's say another one with more noise. Right, this will be the third one. Right, and now I can go back and forth. Right, and now I can even use 8-phase, so I know exactly what's going on. So for example, the init one, I'm just going to map it, I will map it like this, and map the first one to the first button, the second one to the second button, and the third one to the third one, right? And now I know this is init, this is heads, this is noise. Right, and again I can go crazy and hit init, and it will initialize basically. So with 8-phase, you can save scenes or presets or snapshots of any module. And for example, you can save an init state, or you can save even other states and just jump between them. You can sequence this. You can use a MIDI controller, a sequence, some sort of sequencer or module in VCV, and just move between the snapshots, or click one button and go back to the initial preset. We have another one from Neil. I've noticed that you enjoy multiples of 7 in your sequences, 5 and 3 as well. It's clear you're a fan of odd times. In what ways do you think of CV as a polyrhythmic tool? It's really cool when an odd CV signature sits on top of a straight sequence and vice versa. Yeah, so indeed, at VCV, I do this a lot with the ADDR sequencer, because I find ADDR sequencer perfect for modulation. So here, for example, I have an 8-step sequence sequencing pitch, but a 7-step sequence sequencing the timbre, and a 5-step sequence sequencing the sustain. Right, there is some delay, so the sequences will always meet each other in different places, because the pitch will have 8 steps, but the modulation will have 7 and 5. Right, so the sequence sounds longer actually. It takes a while until it's repeating itself. Right, also in hardware I do this a lot. I use the voltage block, which has 8 sequences, and each of them I can set to a different length. So usually I will have one for pitch maybe, and then a few more for all sorts of different modulation, polymetric modulation, polyrhythmic modulation. In VCV, you can create something similar again with ADDR sequencers, or with this Vox glitch sequencer, the digital sequencer, or the digital sequencer, and because it has multiple outputs, and as you can hear, right, I have, for example, this sequence for pitch, and then a few for modulation. So there is one modulating decay, release, resonance, this one, right, of the filter, cut off. And it will take a while until this sequence completes its full cycle and will repeat itself, because each sequence has a different length. Here we have a length of 10, a length of 12, 5, 24, and 16. So the pitch has a length of 16, but all the modulation sequences have a different length, which adds lots and lots of movement even to a simple sequence. So yes, this is a really good idea. This is a really good technique, adding modulation with different rates and with different lengths, so that it will meet the sequence at all sorts of different places, and it will take a while until the sequence itself will repeat. The next one is coming from Brett. In your next video, if there is time, would you please discuss logic and math? Using fixed voltages and some math and logic modules, I was able to tell one VCO only play this F if the other two VCOs voltages divide to 1 or -0.3. And I'd like to do more of that stuff, but really feel like I'm reinventing the wheel, as well as creating very intricate and cumbersome patches. So to be honest, I'm not such a fan of maths and stuff like this, using it in patches. I don't know, I prefer just to go with the flow and not think too much about numbers and stuff like this. So I'm not using this so much in my patches. I don't have so much experience. I should experiment with this more, but I don't find it inspiring, in my opinion, for me. So I don't do this a lot, but there are two things that I will do that are somewhat related. So first of all, I will use a comparator a lot. In most cases, I will use a comparator to split a sequence, a pitch sequence, to two different voices. So as you can see here, I have two voices. I have the divsec from JW sending a sequence to the VCO, simple voice with some delay, and to the modern VCO, again, simple voice with a filter. So the same sequence goes to both voices, but I'm sending the same sequence also to a comparator. Maybe you can see this on the scope also. You see this is the pitch sequence, and I have here a comparator. And the comparator has a fixed voltage of 0 in this case. So everything that's above 0 will go to one voice, everything that's below 0. The sequence itself, the pitch, the notes themselves, will go to the different voice, and like this I split the sequence, and according to this threshold, they will be split in different places. So it will sound like this. Right, it's the same sequence, just split into two voices, and again, according to the threshold. So if I do this at 1, right, just what above 1 volt will go to the one voice, and everything below it will go to the modern VCO. Right, so you can get really interesting sounds like this. This is with the comparator, and I will also use analog logic, not digital or digital logic that will work with gates, but analog logic that works with continuous voltage, continuous signals. So what I will do, I will use a minimum and maximum logic, right? This is analog logic. Basically to generate or to create or to compose another sequence for me from two other sequences. So here I have one voice pen to the left. This is an 8-step sequence. Another voice pen to the right. This is a 7-step sequence. Right? They will sound like this together. Right, and then I'm sending both of them to a logic. In this case, it's again the compare from VCV, but it has also maximum and minimum, which is analog logic. So I'm sending both of them, and I'm using the minimum output to generate another sequence for me that is related. It's the minimum voltages of both sequences, and it will sound like this. Maybe I'll use a triangle wave. Right? Right, so you can get also like this interesting sequences by combining two sequences with analog logic, maximum, minimum. And these are basically the two things that I'm doing, if it's a comparator or if it's analog logic. But more than this, I don't really find it inspiring, in my opinion, to start dealing with thinking about numbers too much and stuff like this. But still, stuff that you can experiment with. So the last question is coming from mistake number 2, I believe. I've been playing around with HetrickCV's new Phasor collection of modules and want to see if you'd have any ideas for some creative or unconventional applications of Phasors. I'm having the time of my life messing around with them, and this is all I can think about right now. Yes, such an interesting collection, and actually I'm working on a whole video about this collection. I still have to see how to approach this, but this will come hopefully soon enough. But for now, I just want to show you that you can use all sorts of different signals as the phasor, as the phase, as the clock basically of these modules. This is the phase-driven sequencer. So basically, if I use something like a saw wave, it will scan through the sequence. Right? Nothing too amazing. I can use a triangle wave to create something like a ping pong. If I use a sine wave, there will be also some sort of rubato or some sort of timing. Right? So it will end and start slowly. Right? This is the nature of a sine wave. Right, but we can also fold and change and use all sorts of other wave shapes to scan through the sequence, right? So if I use something like a wave folder, right, the sound, or not the sound, the wave will look like this. Go up, go down, go up. Maybe I can fold the triangle wave. Right, so you can experiment with all sorts of different waveforms basically to scan. Just something I wanted to show you now, but again, I'm working on a full video about this whole collection, about the phasor collection, about phase clock. Going to be fun. And that was it for today. Thank you again, Patreon, so much for your support. Thank you for your questions. And thank you again, PathSet and Flag, for donating your commercial collections to the monthly giveaways we do on Discord. So if you are a Patreon, come join us on Discord. If you are not a Patreon, come join us on Patreon. Thank you again for watching. Cheers.